All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a quorum. I'm going to go ahead and call the Governmental Affairs Committee to order. Representative Millar had requested that he be allowed to present first due to another meeting, and I'm going to allow him that opportunity. Representative Millar, you have LC 284498S, which will be a Governmental Affairs Committee substitute to House Bill 86.
That's correct. That is correct. Yeah, the reason for the substitute, we worked with the Secretary of State's office on the language. This bill deals with early voting and absentee voting, and in the code, when you talk about absentee, that also applies to early voting. That's why early voting is not mentioned specifically in the bill. But as you know, when we allowed this to happen, in this past year, I'll use my own election as an example, I got about 52% of the votes were cast in my election on Election Day. 48% of the votes were cast prior to Election Day. And right now, when people vote on Election Day, the votes are actually tied back to specific precincts. For example, in the Austin precinct, I might have got 600 votes, my opponent got 300, and I get that data right now. But as respects early voting or absentee voting, all I get right now is the lump sum number. I know I've got 60% of the votes, but they're not tied back to that individual precinct. And what this legislation does, it allows those votes that are cast early or absentee to be thrown back to the specific precinct. The Secretary of State's office is here. They will tell you they think they can do this for minimal cost. And otherwise, quite frankly, our statistics are pretty worthless that we're getting out of elections unless we do this. You know, it wasn't a problem before when less than 10% of the people absentee vote. But I think this is a trend that when people get comfortable with it, they're going to continue to do more and more of this. And even if we cut it back by a week or 10 days, we're still going to have a substantial lot of people early vote. This is not part of the President Obama effect. This is just a fact of life. So that's what the bill does. It's bipartisan support. Democratic leadership signed on it. It's really inside baseball. It's more of interest to us than people that are not involved in politics. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions from members of the committee? 24. Mark.
I don't know if it's okay. Representative, just one question, and unfortunately I wasn't at the subcommittee meeting, but it's my understanding, or I've been told, that this can be done without this law anyway, and I guess that's the clarification. Do we really need this, or are they in the process of doing this? Just address that, please.
Well, I've been told it can be done by rule or regulation. I don't always going to know who's going to be running the Secretary of State's office. And I will tell you right now, if we put it in statute, and that's why they went along with me on this, that then it has to be done. And I think it's very, very important that we make sure it's done and done properly. And this way, you know, I've seen enough things lost in rules and regulation and intent for the past 10 years. This way, I think the intent's pretty clear, and that's the reason for the bill. And again, they've told me already, and they've gone along with it. This minimal cost is what they've said. They testified to that in the subcommittee hearing.
Representative Ralston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support your bill. As I told you in subcommittee, I just want to feel real comfortable about the cost. You today said minimal. Minimal can mean different things to different counties, as you know, right. and I'm sensitive, particularly to rural areas. Sure. So any ideas on what we are looking at? Do y'all, and you might want to get the Secretary of State's office to chime in on that.
Can I defer to them, Mr. Chairman, on this one?
Yes, sir.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Wes Taylor. I'm the Division Director for the Elections Division for the Secretary of State. The minimal cost, really the only cost that we can see that would be involved is the fact that you would need to order ballots under the way this is going to be done by precinct, and they'll have ballot or precincts printed on the ballots, so there may be a slight increase in the number of paper ballots that would need to be ordered. But then again, with the statistics that we're keeping, we should be able to keep it so that the counties have to order a minimal amount of paper ballots, which they may actually end up saving.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Oliver.
At the proper time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion.
Okay. Any further questions from members of the committee? Is there anybody else in the room that would like to speak on this measure? Essentially, what this bill does is require that the absentee and early votes be recorded by precinct.
That's correct.
All right, Representative Oliver, I'll recognize you for a motion.
I move to pass.
The bill has been properly moved and seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, committee member. Thank you all.
All right, next on the agenda, we're going to deal with House Bill 171. Representative Manning is not with us today, but this is a matter that I think everybody has signed off on. You want to wait, Representative Oliver? All right. If it does not, but if we need to wait, we'll wait.
If it's the substitute that we've got for the legislative council, it does incorporate changes.
All right. Michelle, do you want to go to the mic and? Representative Oliver, if you want us to hold it, we will hold it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Last week in subcommittee, the language that was before the committee on House Bill 171 in its original form had some issues, and the Press Association was kind enough to work those issues out with us prior to this meeting. We're both in consensus with the substitute that's before you today, which will achieve the objectives that were stated in last week's meeting, yet not go overly broad, which was the main issue.
And what this legislation seeks to address is where individual email addresses that were being held by police departments were being requested.
Cobb County has a program in which they have alerts that go out to the public if they give them an email address, basically telling them the crime statistics for their area, also provides certain safety tips. And this information was not currently protected, and so that provision is currently now before you in Section 1. And in Section 2, there was a secondary issue that dealt with solicitation, and which if you have there are certain groups out there that would ask a county specifically for personal information of their citizens dealing with utility bills just for solicitation purposes, and this is not what people signed up for utilities for, and so this also provides cover in that particular section.
Any questions from the members of the committee? Representative Chambers.
Mr. Chairman, I know that Social Security numbers are already prohibited by state law in at least 3 or 4 other sections of the open records exemptions. And just as we discussed in subcommittee, I still think that the database that the Cobb County Police Department was handing out is not a formal report and thus was not subject to open records from the beginning to start with.
Is that just a statement?
It's, yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to that? And
Yes,
in order
ma'am.
to try to give the committee a little bit more clarity, the way that they maintain this database, it is a public record, and so they have to give it out as it's maintained. Because that's where they store all the email addresses in order to put out the newsletter.
Any other questions of the presenter? Representative Oliver?
Any of the other statutes in this area talked about email addresses, or is this the first time we've raised that as an issue?
I know that we have a provision for public employees and teachers. I'd have to go back to make sure that email is in there, but it's pretty much laundry listed some of the other things that are in the 11.2 section before you in Section 1.
I'm concerned about the precedent of this. My city of Decatur is doing virtual city hall meetings. It's all a very fast-moving technology, and whether somebody, and I just am trying to consider what the precedent issues here of email or internet connection is, and which email is internet connection, and I just can't figure it all out. But I'm also aware the First Amendment Foundation is not a part of these discussions, and historically there's been a difference between the Press Association and the First Amendment on open records, and that's my uneasiness, Mr. Chairman. I don't think email's ever been discussed in any of these issues before. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think so.
Well, on this particular issue with the email, that's the medium in which those newsletters are translated, and people that are participating in this PINS program for Cobb County aren't expecting other people to be able to get their email addresses simply for getting alerts on what the crime statistics are in their area.
Do you think showing up at a public meeting that you should be able to come to a public meeting and not be identified?
I'm sorry, and not be identified?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I believe that wasn't anticipated in this, is dealing with open meetings just for the records.
And that's where my mind is going.
Okay.
This is a public communication, back and forth.
Well, not so much back and forth. It's just sent out by the government to its citizens. The citizens aren't replying back to it.
That's the question.
Okay.
Is it a back and forth? Is it a public meeting? Is it a dissemination of public information? Who are the participants? Who are the interactive people? And that's where my mind is, which might not be relevant to this discussion.
I don't believe, in my opinion, Representative Oliver, this would constitute an open meeting based on sending out information. And I can look into that issue further for you if you'd like.
Is a virtual city hall meeting an open meeting?
I believe that, well, I guess it depends on the interaction that goes back and forth.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just I'm just thinking aloud with you, and I apologize if I'm holding this up.
Let's do this. I'm going to take the liberty of the chair to hold this bill until some of those questions can be answered. We always want to err on the side of caution on the open records issues. Sure. And so we're gonna hold this. We'll have another committee meeting on Thursday, and I would ask that Representative Oliver and Chambers and some of the others that have asked these questions work with the people to make sure that those are answered.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Hers is pretty simple. Representative Morgan, have you got an excuse for being late? I'm kidding. Would you like to present House Bill 209?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This is House Bill 209 that I am praying is very simple, and provided that it passes out of our committee, that when it gets to rules will be structured so that there will not be any rehashing of old drama from 2005 for many reasons. House Bill 209 just simply allows for students who attend private colleges to use their ID as a form of identification when they go and vote. Currently, students who attend state colleges can do that, but perhaps it was the oversight of sponsors before who just didn't realize that private students weren't allowed that same right. And so this just adds private colleges. I've met with our Secretary of State, and she does not have a problem with this bill. The department does have a couple of, they had a couple of amendments. One was already made, and that is to specify that it has to be a photo ID. And then they have a second one, and we've worked together, and I will present the second amendment, which essentially specifies what kind of private colleges would be able to use their ID, so that we're not having all kinds of schools that we've never heard of. Or
do you want to go ahead and discuss that amendment now?
Sure. Do you have
it with you?
I didn't bring it. Mr. Chairman, I can see what the amendment says.
Okay.
I didn't bring it from the office over.
All right. I'm going to recognize Jeff Lanier, our legislative counsel.
It's 14. Mr. Chairman, what we're trying to do when working with the Secretary of State's office in drafting this amendment was to put in a definition of colleges that are readily ascertainable, so that there's not a unknown group of colleges, I guess, that would be coming up for using IDs. So what I understand the compromise worked out in the language we drafted was going in, and instead of saying private, public and private institutions or colleges and universities, I think, which is in that last line of the bill in the underscored part, we went back and adopted the definition of qualified institutions, I think it is, of higher learning or whatever that's contained in the tuition equalization grant and Hope scholarship programs. That those are the institutions in the state that are available to receive funds from those entities. So we just pieced in the definition. So what the definition will stay now is that a valid photo ID from a qualified institution of higher learning as defined in, and we have a reference there to, I can't remember if I used the Hope Scholarship one or if we used the tuition equalization grant. It was a tuition equalization grant language there. So what that would do is pick up all private and public colleges in the state that are eligible for those funding. And that is a readily ascertainable list that they can provide to the Secretary of State that they can then distribute to all of the election officials, so there's no question about what's an appropriate ID. And if the committee has any questions about the language, I'll be happy to answer those.
Can you write the language down so that we'll know exactly what we're...
I can't remember the reference to the code reference, but I can tell you pretty well the other part, and I can write it down.
We need an amendment to adopt before.
Okay.
While they're working on that, you get...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question was just, how many institutions are we talking about?
The list that I saw, it's probably 35 or 40. And so if you were to name some, we're talking about Agnes Scott College, Emory University, Spelman College, Morehouse College.
Oglethorpe.
It's 34 on the list.
You'll postpone?
It's close, but
with this language in it. So I'm trying to see if we can get it over here to this meeting.
Okay.
So if you want to postpone this and hear another bill, we can get it here.
All right, Representative, they're going to bring from Legislative Council a substitute with the other language in it. And then once you see that language and approve it, we'll come back to this. So we're going to postpone consideration of House Bill 209 to the end of the meeting, if that's okay with you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Graves, you've got H.R. 12.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, H.R. 12 is just the addition of basically 6 words into our Constitution. Currently, the Constitution requires that in order for a person to register to vote, that they be a citizen of the United States and a resident of Georgia. And this just says that we, the General Assembly, will provide for that, for law, for the means of the verification. And the reason for this really just comes from obviously many concerns from across the state where registrars are put in a position to try to verify a person's eligibility for registration. And quite frankly, I don't think they should be put in that position. I think we should provide for the means of that, and I think we'll hear an example of how that can be done here in a moment from Representative Mills. But that's all this does here, is provide that. In the Constitution, it says the General Assembly will provide for it.
Any questions from members of the committee? H.R. 12. Representative Morgan.
Could you explain again why you think this needs to be in the Constitution?
Well, first of all, I believe that the Constitution is clear. It says that a person, in order to register to vote, must be a U.S. citizen and must be a resident of Georgia. And it says that we shall provide for law for the registration of electors, but it doesn't say anything about providing for law as to the verification of those registrars. So this right here simply just says that we, the General Assembly, shall provide for it, and that future General Assemblies as well shall maintain that provision or adopt changes to that provision, but there shall always be a provision for the verification.
Any other questions for the author? Representative Oliver.
Other than a birth certificate and a passport, what documents can prove citizenship upon application?
And that's a great question. This doesn't provide any direction in that manner other than to say that we, the General Assembly, will determine what that is.
Is it y'all's intention to pass both of these? I'm confused about House Bill 45 and is the package, is that your intention?
Mine is H.R. 12, and
Yes,
Representative Mills is the next bill.
We could, I'm sure y'all have talked about this, we could pass both, or we could pass only a statutory correction and not a constitutional correction. Is that, am I understanding this correctly?
I'm sure that's a possibility, but I think it's important to provide a constitutional measure which ensures that that will always be in place. Whatever we as a General Assembly adopt, there shall always be there.
If if verification of citizenship has been pre-cleared by the Justice Department in any other state in the format that it's being set out here.
I'm not familiar of any, but I'm sure Representative Mills is. He's been working on this for many months, and so we'll let him speak to that one.
So my mother didn't have a birth certificate or a passport. How would she prove her citizenship to apply to vote?
I think his provides provisions for that very instance right there, because that's been brought up in subcommittee. But I don't want to speak on his behalf. 7 ways, he says.
Any other questions for the committee of the author? We've got a couple of people that have signed up to speak on this issue. We have D.A. King.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is D.A. King. I am here today as a private citizen. My intention is simply to offer some observations and maybe a little bit of basic education. I want to make it very clear, I hope that everybody in this building is as adamant as I am about allowing everyone who is eligible to vote in this state to vote. in the elections to which they are eligible. I came today to simply point out how elections and voter rules, and especially registration rules, are conducted in other countries, and I think it might be of some interest to this committee. And I will use the excuse me, I will use the sovereign nation of Mexico to our south. In Mexico, when one wants to register to vote, you must present a series of documents, including a birth certificate. When you are successful in registering, you are issued a federal voter ID. You may not vote in Mexico as a Mexican voter without presenting the Mexican voter ID. I have a blown-up image of a Mexican voter ID from a card we found in the desert about 25 feet north of the barbed wire fence that separates our nation from that of Mexico. And I'm holding it up a blown-up version of this to simply illustrate what can be done. I have no idea that we are going to make our voting system as secure or our registration system as secure as it is in Mexico, but I would like the committee to please respectfully note that on the Mexican voter ID that you cannot obtain without presenting, again, a series of documents, including your birth certificate and proof of residence. There is a photograph. What cannot be seen because of this blown-up model is a hologram on the front. On the back, there is a barcode. The potential voters and the registered voters' fingerprint, a signature, and a large series of numbers, all of which mean something to the poll worker. And again, I do this only to hope that when we are considering what rules to put in place for registering to vote here in the state of Georgia, that we will realize that we have a long way to go to even make it as secure a system as it is in Mexico. Because I study immigration and border security, I know how secure Mexico's voting system is and how successful they have been. This system that I just described in Mexico does not ever draw cries of somehow unfairness to any particular special interest group or foreign language speakers. I would like to point out, I think I passed out a little application from Blockbuster Video to everyone. I hope that got around. If you look right below the top right-hand corner, you'll see that to walk into a Blockbuster Video and obtain an account to rent a DVD, you have to present a military ID, a driver's license ID, or a state-issued ID, all of which can only be obtained by, again, presenting your birth certificate. To draw attention to that, sometimes when I do this presentation, I bring a blown-up copy of my Blockbuster Video card. My hope is that you will vote yes on both of the bills discussing registration. I don't think we are going to make our system today as secure as it is in Mexico, but I would hope that we can take a step forward in making our voter registration as secure as is the Blockbuster Video account process. That was pretty much all I had to say. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions from members of the committee? We don't have any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your presentation. We have Paula McKinney and Neil Bradley with the League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Neil Bradley. I'll speak on this. I am representing the League of Women Voters today, and the League of Women Voters is, of course, in favor of citizens voting and only citizens voting. But however you feel on the issue of documentation on H.R. 45, this resolution that the amendment to the Constitution is not needed. I have been doing voting rights litigation for 37 years. The Constitution already gives the legislature the power, as it is exercised, to regulate voter registration. Registrars have the obligation to check into your qualifications, which are age, residence, everything else, whether or not you're serving time, and citizenship. If you say, as this resolution does, you particularly have the power to look into citizenship, that implies you don't have the power to look into residence, age, and other qualifications. It really isn't necessary, and that's the only point I want to make. The power currently in the Constitution is perfectly authorizes the legislature to do whatever it wants to have registrars verify people's bona fides. Thank you. I'll answer any questions if you.
Representative Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since you've been working on this issue, if you will, for over 37 years, how frequently do you come across cases where non-citizens are voting? How serious is this a problem? I'm trying to get a sense of why we're sort of having this discussion. I know that in our subcommittee meeting, the Secretary of State's office was talking about the number of people who came up for verification, if you will, for citizenship, which was the first time that I'd ever heard anything like that. And according to them, the AJC wrongly reported that the Department of Justice made a statement of how, I'm getting to my question, Mr. Chair, of how uncommon it was for our state, for any state, to have that many inquiries. And so I think there's a little bit of confusion, quite frankly, about this whole citizenship piece and whether it needs to be in the Constitution, if clarification needs to be made in the law. So if you could speak from your experience as to, is this an issue? And if there is, how is it that we can clarify it?
The instances of non-citizens voting is extremely, extremely rare. Every study that has done it finds that it is more stories and allegations, but not proof that it actually happened. Let me give you, when the Secretary of State has testified, they were asked last week in hearings. I mean, they identified potentially 5,000 people in October that they said were not citizens. We know that 2,040 of them came forward with their proof of citizenship. The other 3,000 have not yet been identified as to whether or not they are citizens. So all we know is they have not come forward with their proof of documentation. When the Secretary of State's office was asked, they came up and said, one person came and volunteered and said, I'm a non-citizen. So we have that one example. Almost every example is people being given wrong information, as happened in Long County and Atkinson County, or people go to the Driver's License Bureau and say, I am not a citizen, I do not want to register to vote, and they get registered anyway, sometimes by DMV. And that just shouldn't happen. That's a matter of training that needs to be done at DMV. Let me give you one other example. I'm involved in the litigation here in Georgia, and I'm also involved in litigation in Arizona, which is the only state that has a similar law to this. And that law was enacted by initiative and referendum. It wasn't done through any proof of any problem. And Arizona was able to identify 0 people in the last 10 years that were non-citizens who actually voted. 0. And when that law in Arizona went into effect, in about the first 30 months, about 33,000 people had their applications rejected because they didn't tender paper proof of citizenship. 10,000 of those or so got registered in time to vote last year. 90% of those people, all 33,000, both Anglos and whites, put down that they were U.S. citizens. They swore that they were U.S. citizens. We don't know about those other 20,000. We know they haven't come forward, but basically it is unlikely that any of them, except somebody been given wrong information, actually registered to vote who was not a citizen, and none of them voted. So everywhere we have looked, there's a paper that will be tendered by the ACLU that cites another study that talks at length about this. It's a link in the paper, but it really is more stories and urban stories than actual finding a person, actual evidence that this has happened.
Can I ask a question there? Did I understand that basically you said that there were 20,000, if you did the math, that did not come back onto the voter rolls?
That is correct. They had not come back by last election time.
Why wouldn't they? I mean, if they were a citizen and registered to vote, why wouldn't they come back and show proof of citizenship?
Well, they don't do it because people are easily deterred. is my understanding. We did a survey. A lot of them had documents, but they now had to go to the courthouse before the election to get this done. They were just deterred. I mean, people do get deterred easily. But it is not, within the realm of logic that if the state couldn't identify a single person in 10 years who was a non-citizen who had voted, that suddenly 20,000 people showed up who had applied to register to vote and were not citizens. If that answers your question. I mean, some of those 20,000 have since gotten registered, I'm sure, but we don't have evidence of that since the trial has been held and the discovery's been cut off.
Representative Powell.
Button on 18, it's coming on.
Well, it lit up over here.
But it is now. I tend to agree. As I read this, I tend to agree with what you're saying, that it's not necessary. It's already a known fact that the Constitution provision that the legislature, that we can already show cause and to pass laws about providing the means of verification. I mean, that's what the bill we just heard, 209, was about, was adding a ID from private college. And I hear what you're saying, and while I tend to agree it's not needed, but could you tell me, you've got a reason that if it's not needed, so it shouldn't have any other impact than what we're doing, what is the negative impact of us doing this?
There's just basically one. You just don't need another constitutional amendment. We have enough of them in this state. Just from a good government perspective, we don't need it. And as I alluded to, if you put in a specific power, there's like 4 qualifications under Georgia to vote. You got to be age 18, you got to be a citizen, you got to be not serving time, and you got to be not declared mentally disabled. I believe that's it. Well, if you say, here's one, the legislature has the specific power to check citizenship and doesn't say anything about the other 3, it implies they don't have the power to check on the other 3. Now, that's crazy, but that's what this does. I mean, if I were a lawyer and you came in and said, you gave them the specific power to do this 1 of 4, what about these other 3? Do they not have the power to do those other 3? That's what lawyers do.
So, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, since I think what we're agreeing, I think we're all agreeing that the Constitution is the base fabric of government organization. The legislature is endowed in parts of that Constitution. We meet on the second Monday of every January to pass laws that shouldn't be in disagreement with the Constitution, but we're giving the power, legislative power by the Constitution to do these. And it looks, and as I read it, it's these 5 words in here basically says what we already know, that the legislature already has those means to verify citizenship, because there's nothing that's more precious than to have a straight up and down election and that people are supposed to vote are voting. So I'll say again that and I'm not an attorney, so explain to me what is the flip side, that if we already have this authority, why would you have opposition other than the fact that we don't need it? It's already there. Because this legislature, I've watched it for 20 years, we're so redundant that we pass more and more laws that's already on the books just to clarify the law. So why wouldn't this be needed?
Well, the basic point is you don't need it. That is my basic point. But I would also say the legislature has passed these laws, such as voter ID bills and other things, and given the power to registrars to check on residency. Now, I can ask you, do they have the power to do that? If you think there's a need to amend this Constitution to check on one qualification, the law, it questions the authority of the laws that have been put in place over the past 50 years that says go out and check on residency and citizenship and everything else. You're saying the legislature hasn't had the power up until today to do this. That's the implication of this amendment. It's a small risk, it's unnecessary, and the bill is unnecessary, is my point.
Representative Oliver.
Back to my question on preclearance. Are you in litigation in Arizona because of preclearance? It was precleared, or tell me if anybody has ever precleared the statute that requires proof of citizenship before voting.
Yes, Arizona was precleared. It is not identical to this bill on citizenship. It's different in one respect. There's no fail-safe provision here. But the difference is that it was precleared prior to implementation. And so Justice did not have any racial information about the impact of the bill. In Georgia, we will now have some data about implementation because of the Secretary of State's implementation last October of a citizenship check about these 5,000 people that were flagged. And whatever that racial information is, we do not have yet, and Justice does not have yet, but Justice has asked for that. And that information will tell whether or not it can be pre-cleared.
I have one follow-up question that may be related to Mr. Powell's question. What is the total amount of attorney fees that's been billed in relation to the litigation you're involved here in Georgia and the voter ID from both sides? How much of the taxpayers paid for the litigation?
Well, the only proceedings were on preliminary injunction back in October, and there's been no fee application yet, so I don't have a number. I'm sorry, and I don't know how much the state has paid out.
Based on your other history of litigation over voting rights cases, would it be fair to say it would be in excess of a few $1 million that we would spend on these 6 words?
I don't know a few million, but it will be 6 figures.
Any further questions from the members of the committee? Is there anybody else that would like to speak on this issue? Representative Graves, I think somebody was coming behind you.
My name is Jerry Gonzalez. I'm Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials, and we would like to state our opposition to H.R. 12. It's not necessary, and I believe it is being used as a get-out-the-vote mechanism, so we need to be careful about tinkering with the Constitution as a get-out-the-vote effort. Thank you. I'll take any questions if you have them.
Any questions? Representative Powell.
Then I'll ask a question that I asked the attorney before you. So you're narrowing it down. You think this will be a wedge issue that will be used?
Yes, I believe this will be a wedge issue that will be used to paint. Again, we don't have time for this type of nonsense. There isn't a single proof of any person that's not eligible that has voted in the elections, and it's not necessary, and we shouldn't tinker with the Georgia Constitution simply for a get-out-the-vote mechanism.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Graves, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple closing remarks after hearing from them. You know, the only time it's unnecessary to amend the Constitution is when you don't care about protecting the rights of others. The Constitution has clearly been crafted to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. This section is about the right to register and vote. Those who speak against it and say it's unnecessary just don't care about the rights of those who are wanting to register and to vote. It's about protecting those who are lawfully residing in the United States and in Georgia and meet the criteria in which to register to vote. And if there is a wedge, yeah, it's wedging them against the unlawful who are trying to register to vote, who are being coerced into registering to vote and shouldn't be. So is this a get-out-the-vote effort? I guess if they want to classify it that way, it is, because we want every possible law-abiding citizen in Georgia who's registered to vote to get out to vote. That's all this is about.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Any further questions of Representative Graves? All right. I'm going to represent. I'm going to, yeah. Representative Meadows.
Yes, on House Resolution 12, I'd make a motion to pass.
All right. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. H.R. 12 has been properly moved and seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign? No. Let's do it by show of hands. All in favor, please signify by raising your right hand. All right. We'll get 4. Any opposed, same sign. HR 12, 4-3. All right. HR 12's moved forward to the Rules Committee. Thank you, Representative Graves. Representative Mills, you have House Bill 45. We have several people that have asked to speak on this. I'm not going to set a time limit, but I will ask you to be, once we get past the author, would ask those who speak. We'll go in order from which you were signed up. Would ask you to be to the point, if possible. Thank you. Representative Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I bring before you a substitute to House Bill 45. It's LC number 284599S, just to make sure we're working off the same. This was what passed out of subcommittee, and I thank the chairman and the members for listening to this bill today. First of all, why is this legislation needed? Number one, to protect the integrity of the elections process by ensuring that only legal citizens participate in electing the leaders in the state of Georgia. Number two reason is that this bill would streamline the process. Right now, we kind of do this backwards, and that is we allow people to vote, and then if there's a question about their citizenship, we begin to dig into it, and then we question them about providing proof of citizenship. Is sort of backwards. This legislation was patterned after what has passed in Arizona, what has been challenged in the courts in Arizona, and has been pre-cleared by the courts. And also, as was testified a minute ago, we have proof that many citizens who claim to be citizens showed up at the polls prior to the passage of this in Arizona who are not showing up in the next election cycle for whatever reason. In the state of Georgia, we, through our counties, just our counties, we had 599 challenge ballots that were flagged in the past election cycle that dealt with a potential non-citizen. So when someone stands up here and says these are just whims or fabrications, I would say to you that's simply not true. And I would challenge them to challenge the Secretary of State's report, which issued these numbers that I'm giving to you. 230 of those challenge ballots were rejected by the Secretary of State's office because voter citizenship could not be confirmed. In the last election cycle in November, that was just what was turned in by the counties. In the last election cycle, the State Elections Division sent, as was cited earlier, 4,771 citizenship status advisory letters to people who had voted in the November 4th election. Out of those sent, only 43% have responded and provided proof of U.S. citizenship. 57% have not responded. And I would just say to the members of the committee that our voting election process, I consider it to be almost sacred. And that is that when I talk to moms and dads who have sent their sons and daughters overseas and they've spilled their life's blood, that I might have the right as a citizen to participate in this process. It lessens the sacrifice given by them on the battlefield when we don't have measures in place that protect that a citizen is voting. I heard it said earlier that this has not been proven, that it's not been taking place. That is such a fabrication. That's the nicest way I can say it. On September 25th, 2007, Jerry Metz, who was an Axon County Commissioner, was found guilty of registering people who were non-citizens to vote in Georgia. That's not a fabricated name. It's not a fabricated number. But if you stand behind this microphone and you tell a committee of the Georgia General Assembly that there's no record or no documentation, now either the Secretary of State's office is lying to me or you're lying. And that's for the committee to decide. But I think the Secretary of State's office has been honest with me. And that's why I produced the bill that is patterned after the law in Arizona. They can provide 7 different mechanisms. They're listed at the beginning and top of page 2 on the bill, lines 29 through line 52. Mechanisms that they can provide proof of citizenship when they register to vote. If you're already registered to vote, you do not have to provide proof of citizenship. You're grandfathered in. It would be a logistical nightmare to go back and get everyone's proof of citizenship at this point. But we can, going forward, improve our elections process. And Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to try to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Representative Mills. Chairman Mills. Representative Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Mills, I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, with all due respect to the members of our citizens of our state who are here to testify against or for this bill and for the one that we saw before, how does it make you feel as the author of the bill to have groups who are supportive, who are associated with some hate groups? I mean, if we were just to talk about the politics and the ramifications of when these kinds of bills are before us, we didn't hear anybody in support of the bill, but the people in support of your bill, in support of Representative Graves' bill, but the people who are in opposition of it, in support of it, tend to be associated with some groups that are less than stellar in terms of the work that they do, in terms of the kinds of things that they espouse. And so I'm just wondering, how does that make you feel as an author when you're saying you're looking to do one thing, but the people who are associated with what you want to do are probably not the kinds of folks that you would associate with, I would assume.
Could you be a little more specific and state to me those groups that you find to be less than stellar, so I would know who you're talking about? Because nobody's even testified at this point on behalf of my bill.
Well, the issue is what I'm referring to. But, for example, there are some white supremacy groups that are in support of this issue, as an example.
Are there any white supremacy groups in here being represented? I'm not aware of any. If someone was promoting one race over another race, I would be adamantly opposed to that. What I am for, adamantly, is to protect the legal right for any citizen to be able to participate in our voting process. It is less than stellar and dishonest to stand in front of this podium and tell elected officials on this committee that there's no examples of fraudulent votes. We have people from the Secretary of State's office right here that can verify that were elected by stellar people of of the state of Georgia, and that's just not true. And frankly, I just find it very disheartening that someone would make a statement like that.
I have another question, Representative.
I've got a couple of other questions. Can we?
Okay. It'll be brief, Mr. Chair. And it's really about the merits of the bill itself. So going to your logic that you kind of laid out when you were presenting the bill, you said that we do the process backwards and people have to prove their citizenship if there is a question. And so following that logic, would you argue the same point for proving age or proving that you are not a felon? So in other words, should citizens who are wanting to register to vote have to also prove that they are not felons and should be able to vote?
Well, I think that would happen in the application process if we were to pass a House bill, substitute to House Bill 45 that is before you. It would. It's almost as Representative Oliver was questioning before about pre-clearance, wanting to make sure that something is constitutional before we put it in place. Well, if that makes sense, and it does, then wouldn't we want to sort of pre-clear somebody before we gave them the right to participate in our process when we already say you're supposed to be a citizen when you go to the polls and vote? And yet when we have facts that document people are voting in the process that are non-citizens.
You didn't answer my question, Mr. Chair. It's okay.
Representative Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Mills, I keep looking at all of this, and while I didn't particularly see the need not to be in favor of adding this constitutional provision earlier as a specific language, I look at this. Is this not already covered under Georgia statute? Isn't this the same stuff that we went to battle over 2 years ago that basically sets forth the criteria to being able to register to vote?
It's not. Again, this does it on the front end, and that is that somebody can fill out a voter application now, sign, and say that they're a citizen when they're not a citizen. Then they turn it in. Then they get to vote, and then later on we may or may not discover that they're not a citizen. What this bill would do is it would, when they apply for that process, it would be caught and cross-referenced with several different things, either the passport or are they here legally on the naturalization documents, are they under the Federal Immigration Reform Act on Section E. So it stops it on the front side rather than after the election.
The current Georgia code that we dealt with 2 years ago specified criteria in law that you had to meet to be able to register to vote. Is that correct? Current law.
I'm not
Current
sure
language.
which one you're referring to, but
2 years ago,
I'm
the big
sure
ribbit that we had up here 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or whenever it might have been. But in the Georgia code, it specified what you have to show as far as documentation that you are a United States citizen to register to vote. This looks like the identical same stuff. So what's the need for this as to what we already have on the statutes?
it's hard for me to respond not knowing exactly what you're referring to, but I bet somebody from the Secretary of State's office knows the bill.
Chairman Mills, I think I can. It was different than citizenship. You're talking, I believe, about voter ID and the different documents that were available.
When someone shows up at the polls,
to essentially show that you are who you say you are at the poll.
No,
this would have to do with the registration of the voter prior to that, and I think I may be wrong, Representative Powell, but I think what you're talking about might be the bill that dealt with when you do go to the polls to actually vote, what you show.
That you actually are who you say you are when you show up at the polls by showing some proof of identification.
So
that's what we dealt with then.
So what you're saying is that it's your belief that the voter ID that we passed 2 or 3 years ago to specify that you are who you are, then you're saying this says you have to prove this to be able to register to vote. Is that what we're saying?
This bill, the emphasis is on the registration of a voter for the first time. They may not even ever show up to vote. I hope they do. And my bill is not a get out to vote bill, but I really scratch my head. Why would anybody ever be opposed to getting somebody out to vote, whether they're a member of your party or not your party? Isn't that what we all believe in? That folks would get out and vote that are legal and participate in the process?
Further question then, as I look down through here, and I don't really have any problems with all of these, except I do have a problem the same that I had a few years ago with that ID bill, and that's it. What do we do about folks who don't have? And in the real world, we got people who do not have IDs. They don't have driver's licenses. They don't have certified IDs in advance. They don't have a lot of people, believe it or not. We've got some elderly people who don't have birth certificates. Is there some language that we could add to this to be absolutely sure? Because I agree with what you say. I have a real problem with people voting or registering to vote who don't meet the criteria. But at the same time, I got a real problem with the idea that we're going to deny someone the accessibility to go and register to vote simply because they're old, or they may not know any better, or they don't have an ID? Is there some language that we could add to this have you got an idea of something that might could be added to this to ensure that we are not denying someone that right just because they don't have one of these paper pieces of ID here?
Right, that's an excellent question. I appreciate you asking it. And it actually came up in subcommittee, and we added language, the G language, on page 2 of line 51 to cover exactly what you're talking about. Because anybody who didn't have a specific, let's say they didn't have a birth certificate for whatever reason, I've actually come across some people that, since introducing this bill, that didn't have a birth certificate. And so I see the language there listed in G as somewhat necessary to allow them, because that's not my desire. My desire is not to keep anyone who is here as a legal citizen from participating in the process. It is my desire to say this sacred ground when we get in the voting booth and we lessen the lost life of someone's blood who died on the battlefield when we know there are documented cases of people slipping through our system. This tightens the holes.
One other question, if I may, the indulgence of the chair. You're talking about G on line 5152?
Correct.
Do you know what those rules and regulations are currently that the State Elections Commission that they have? I saw somebody with the elections guy with the Secretary of State's office. If you don't know, maybe he can tell us what these rules and regs are.
I'd have to defer to them with the permission of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Rob Sims, Deputy Secretary of State. Representative Powell, to your question, I think the intent of the language in G is not to codify current rules and regulations for the State Election Board, is to give the State Election Board the ability or to set forth that they can create rules in the context of this bill to possibly address some of those concerns that you have.
So you're saying y'all don't currently have rules and regs?
Oh, no, that we have a volume of rules and regulations that deal with everything under the sun in election administration, but specific to the State Election Board has not passed rules that would comport with the legislation in front of you. And in fact, the rulemaking process comes on the backside, where after the legislation is passed, they can pass rules that would I guess help foster the enactment of the legislation that's passed or the application of the legislation.
So what you're saying, y'all don't have any rules and regs that spell out that if a citizen does not have an acceptable form of ID, can't find a birth certificate, they got the family Bible or whatever that showed that they were born 89 years ago. You're saying that y'all don't have rules and regs that would spell that out?
Specific to voter registration?
Right.
No, sir. No, sir.
Would y'all be acceptable, and would the authors be acceptable, maybe to, in this language, craft some language to change that if this bill passes that says that the Board of Elections will promulgate those rules and regulations to ensure that citizens or people who petition to register to vote, that if they don't have one of these forms of IDs, that they can show some other form or proof, whether it be testimony from family members or people in the community? Would y'all have any problems with that?
Passing in the bill itself, that directing the State Election Board to pass rules?
Sure. This looks to me to be the very appropriate line to do it, since this is calling for rules and regs that y'all don't have to basically establish that y'all will do it.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I think the language that the subcommittee added, which the lines you're talking about, I think that does that exact thing. Other documents or methods of proof that are established under the rules and regulations of the State Election Board, that covers it. And if Legislative Council, they're the one who drafted the amendment with your idea in mind.
Right. But I'm thinking that do we not need to prompt this further, that they will establish these rules and regulations? Well, just by saying that they can doesn't mean that they will.
Right, but if we pass this, then they're going to have to, if someone shows up and says, I'm 90 years old. I've never registered to vote, but I want to vote, and I don't have a birth certificate. Then they can make their case before the State Board of Election, and then they'll be allowed to register to vote under this language. And again, let me emphasize, this is only for people who have never registered to vote. You're grandfathered in if you're already registered to vote.
Representative Mills, I think Representative Powell, I know that I have two citizens that I represent that are over the age of 80 that have only recently gotten a state identification card, and they had to go before the board with Department of Driver Services, if I remember correctly, to get approval from that board to actually have that state identification card issued. This situation comes about when somebody essentially lives under common law marriage, Social Security numbers under, or Social Security cards under one name, and everything else in their life is under something else, or under a maiden name. And I guess I'd ask maybe Rob from Secretary of State's office, the person now in the situation I'm talking about, this particular individual now has an official state identification card. Prior to that, how would they have registered to vote?
Well, Mr. Chairman, in the situation you just described, in order to get a identification card from DDS, they have to prove citizenship or proof of legal residence. So they would not be able to register to vote unless they were proving citizenship through the DDS side of the process.
As of last year?
Well, as of 2005, actually.
All right. Thank you. Representative Morgan.
There's just so much to say, Mr. Chair, but I don't like information that's sort of not clear. Rob, what's your last name?
Sims.
Mr. Sims just said that in order to get a voter ID, you have to show proof of citizenship, and then said, or proof of residence, and those are two different things. And so I want to be clear when we talk about the process here of what people can show when they are actually trying to get an ID to go and vote, and showing proof of citizenship, which are two different things. But my other question is in terms of process in this bill. Right now, you can register to vote by filling out a form, sending it in. You may or may not put a copy of whatever the proof is in this form, but you are still going to be able to register to vote, and then you get the letter saying, we don't have that proof. Can you show that? So my question is, in terms of process, if this were to pass, how do people register to vote without going through this? We're talking about citizens here. Mm-hmm. How are they going to register to vote without going to the Board of Elections? Where does the Board of Elections meet? How do people get time? How should someone, a 90-year-old in particular, or someone who works, how are they supposed to take off work to prove, when they've been probably working all their lives and paying taxes and doing all the things that the average citizen does, to prove their eligibility to be able to vote in their state? Why would we put all of these barriers in place when we're trying to catch two people, or whatever the very small number is of non-citizens that are actually voting?
Mr. Chairman, now, Representative Morgan, first to address the issue of quantifying the problem, I think the state ventures into very difficult and troubling areas where we try and put a number definition onto what is a problem and what is not. And I guess the question I would ask in return is, does the legislature have a definition as to how many fraudulent votes cast actually quantify a problem? We've seen in elections throughout the country, we have a recount underway in Minnesota today that could turn on a dozen votes. And what I do know, and what we can show definitively, is in 2008, 5,000 residents of this state attempted to register to vote, having previously told the state they were not citizens of the United States. Those are significant real numbers. But as to the barriers and to the problems with documentation, simply put, when you send in your voter registration form today, you are not automatically registered to vote. You have to provide documentation either before you appear to vote in person or to the registrar's office at the time of voting to say that you are under HAVA qualified to vote. This is not creating a new process. This is not creating new bureaucracy or new hurdles. The process is in existence today. What we are doing and supporting doing in this legislation is refining the documents that can be provided in order to qualify someone's eligibility to vote. That's it. There's a process in existence today. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, real briefly, I think it's also worth pointing out that the Secretary of State's office was running a verification program for the 2008 election cycle as required by federal law. And many of my friends in the audience today who are speaking in opposition to this bill sued us and sued the Secretary of State, the state of Georgia, in federal court to stop the verification process from occurring. And yet, well, it was not illegal. In fact, the federal courts ruled in favor of the state and put in the federal court order that we had to do the process that we were doing. So what we're doing here in response to many of the arguments and concerns expressed in the federal litigation is codifying the process into law. So it's ongoing. It has been going on. So to say on one hand it's not needed, but to have argued 6 months ago and sued us in federal court to say that it was too burdensome and too onerous is kind of arguing out of both sides of one's mouth.
Representative Oliver. Oh, I'm sorry. Representative Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Mills, in essence, the way I see this, it's taking a process, and as you said earlier, we're just simply moving it forward so that a person actually has to meet the criteria and qualifications to actually register versus waiting until they've actually tried to cast a vote or have cast a vote and a red flag has come up and deal with it then. So to me, it's pretty straightforward. In essence, isn't that what this is really doing, is just being proactive to say we want everybody to register that's legal, that should vote, and it should register. There's a process in place, and rather than get held up at the last minute at the election cycle, let's go ahead and do it early on.
You are correct, and I think that we already provide proof of citizenship to get your driver's license. I certainly don't think it's too onerous in this situation to make sure that it is a sacred event in my mind when we go to the polls and vote, no matter whether you're independent, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter to me. I'm grateful that you're participating in the process, and this bill was designed with the method to protect the integrity of that process.
Thank you, Representative Mills. We're going to move forward and let some people from the public testify. We've got Kyla Berry and Marvin Lim from MALDEF. Kyla Berry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kyla Marshall Berry. I'm a 22-year-old graduating senior at Spelman College with a major in English and a minor in creative writing. I'm here today to talk about something that happened to me in the fall of 2008. I received a letter on October 10th from the Fulton County Department of Registration and Elections saying that it had come to their attention that I was not a citizen of the United States and that I would not be able to vote in the upcoming general election unless I provided proof of citizenship within 1 week of the date of the letter. The problem was that the letter was dated October 2nd and was not postmarked until October 9th. Therefore, I had no time to respond to the request, which one I assumed to be bogus. I am a United States citizen. I was born on January 5th, 1987 in Boston, Massachusetts. Everyone in my family is American and was born here. Thankfully, I was allowed to vote. I did so early on October 30th. However, when I went to talk to someone at the courthouse, I was met with ignorance. The clerk with whom I spoke about the letter and the questions surrounding my citizenship had no idea what I was talking about. I went through the trouble of bringing my passport plus other forms of ID to ensure that I could prove my citizenship, and I was the one who got the look of confusion from the very people who had sent the letter. I have no idea why I, an American citizen and Georgia resident since August of 2005, received such a disturbing letter so close in date to what many have called the election of a lifetime. I would never want to cast aspersions about Georgia or America, but I am aware of a serious history of voter disenfranchisement in Georgia and around the nation. My first thought when I received the letter was that it was a hoax, sent by someone trying to intimidate me, a black woman, from voting in a crucial election, especially since it would be widely assumed that I was voting for Barack Obama. My inkling that the letter was fabricated intensified when I called the number listed in the letter for Fulton County, and no one answered. Although it was the actual number for the courthouse, I found it incredibly suspicious that no one picked up. When I found out that 50,000 others had received a similar letter, I was even more outraged that no one could answer my questions, and by the sheer enormity of it all. It is my sincere and profound belief that laws that create barriers for actual citizens to vote by using faulty databases of information or other such preventative measures are wrong and unfair. Of course, if a person is not a citizen, he or she should not be permitted to vote. But there are many Americans who do not have the proof of ID this new law would require, either because they are elderly and do not have driver's licenses, or because they are women who change their names after marriage, or a whole host of other reasons. And if the database that drew my name continues to be used to disenfranchise other legal citizens, then the entire point of voting, democracy, and basic American freedoms is lost. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Have you got a copy of that letter?
Elise, do you have it? I don't have it on me, no.
If you're not willing to, that's fine. But the goal of this committee is, we're going to protect people's right to vote who are legally in this country and are legally registered. If we've got something that's going on by a board of registration that needs to be corrected, I think you would be well pleased with the actions of this committee, both Republican members and Democrat members, in the action that we would attempt to take against any board of registration that was disenfranchising legal voters. So if you don't mind, if you don't want to provide the copy, that's fine, but if you'll provide the copy, if there's a problem there with the board of registration, I assure you we will attempt to address it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marvin Lim. I'm in Norcross, Georgia, and I'm currently a graduate social work student at Georgia State. And I want to thank the members of this committee and the General Assembly for listening to my testimony. This issue is very important to me, as it is to many others. I'm here as a naturalized citizen to speak about my experience in voting in this past November's election. I became a naturalized U.S. citizen in June of 2007 in Washington, D.C., where I had been working since graduating from Emory University here in Atlanta in 2005. In August of 2007, I moved back to Atlanta, Georgia, which was my longtime state of residence prior to Washington. And that very month, as someone who tries to take his responsibilities seriously, I submitted my voter registration card to Gwinnett County, who in a few weeks' time confirmed my voter registration. I made a conscious decision not to vote in the primaries in February of 2008. So my first election was going to be in November of 2008. As someone who anticipates scheduling and delays, I decided that I would vote early via absentee ballot. So I faxed my absentee ballot application to the Gwinnett County Elections Department on October 2nd of 2008, more than a month before the election. I then called the next day to confirm the receipt, and they told me they couldn't do that because they had so many, but that in about 2 weeks' time I could check the the Secretary of State's poll locator website to confirm the processing of my application, and I was satisfied with that answer. Unfortunately, I checked the website 2 weeks later, and it still did not show that my application had been processed. The following Monday of October 20th, I called the office. This time, given the closer proximity to the elections, my wait on the phone was longer, about 15 minutes, and then I spoke to someone who did not know why my application had not been processed. She did note, however, that there was a flag on my name showing me as a non-citizen. This puzzled me because I was indeed a citizen, and I had a certificate and pictures with the judge from my naturalization ceremony to prove it. The employee then transferred me to someone in the absentee ballot office specifically, and she told me to clear things up, I could fax my certificate of naturalization to the office to an alternate fax number, and that I could call back and ask to speak with her personally once I did so to confirm. And I was satisfied with that answer, so I sent my certificate as well as a second request for an absentee ballot just in case. So I called back in a couple of days, and it took another 30 minutes this time before I was able to speak to someone. But unfortunately, once I got through, I was told that the department could not confirm proof of my citizenship, that I was still showing as a non-citizen, and that my absentee ballot requests, both of them, had not been processed. Furthermore, when I asked to speak to the person with whom I previously spoken in the absentee ballot office, they told me they were actually not allowed to transfer me to anyone in that office, and that furthermore, I should just appear at the department offices to submit my citizenship documents. First of all, that was impractical in the first place, given transportation and scheduling. And second of all, even if I had the time and transportation available, going down to the department offices would have entailed even more waiting and would have essentially defeated the purpose of submitting an absentee ballot request in the first place. I said so as much to the person to whom I was speaking, and she said the only alternative would be to fax my documents again, which I did so. The next time I called was a couple days later. This time I figured in order to avoid the long wait times, I could call exactly at 8 a.m. when they opened. Unfortunately, I was wrong. I still had to wait another 20 minutes, after which I spoke to an employee who, again, wasn't able to tell me what was going on and that I was still a non-citizen, but did offer to have an employee look into the situation who would then call me back by 7 p.m. that evening. Because of complications, I missed that message, and so I called again the next day, and after another 20-minute wait, I reached someone who could not tell me again what was happening with my documents, but like the previous day offered to have someone call me back. Someone did so this time, and I picked up the phone, and she just advised me to refax all my papers, including my citizenship papers, to 3 different fax numbers in succession, and that she would call me back before 9 p.m. that very night to confirm receipt. So I did that, and she did call me, but she couldn't confirm receipt because all the countless faxes for that evening had actually been collected and compiled. Because I had essentially fax blasted my documentation, however, I was cautiously confident that the documentation would be processed, and surely enough, the next day, I checked the Secretary's poll locator website, and my application had at long last, after a month, been processed. However, the next day, on October 20th, I received in the mail a letter dated October 28th, sent by Secretary Karen Handel. The letter informed me that I had been flagged as a possible non-citizen and that I should contact my local county registrar to provide proof of citizenship. I was hoping that this was just a pure coincidence, but of course I had to check. So that very day I called the Gwinnett County Elections Department, and I was on hold again for 20 minutes. Once I got through, a gentleman confirmed indeed that my absentee ballot application had been processed, but that my ballot had not been sent out because I was still being flagged as a non-citizen. The gentleman further informed me that I should send my proof of citizenship to the Secretary of State's office, although Ms. Handel's letter specifically stated that the document should be sent to the local registrar. He also made a suggestion that I said I should just probably come down on Election Day with my proof of citizenship to vote, and on grounds of both practicality and principle, I nixed that idea. And then finally, on Saturday, November 1st of 2008, I received my absentee ballot, by which time I had to express mail it on November 3rd, the day before the election, costing me $5 to do so overnight first delivery. So after 5 absentee ballot requests, 5 different fax numbers, about 2 hours just on hold on the phone, and a $5 postmark / de facto poll tax later, I was able to vote for the first time as a U.S. citizen. Now, did my vote actually go through? Well, the poll locator did confirm receipt of my absentee ballot, but as I never confirmed that the non-citizen flag was taken off my record, maybe it actually didn't count. Once I received my ballot, I figured that was victory enough, and I had family, school, and work matters to deal with, and I figured I fulfilled my civic responsibilities up to that point. And so, members of this committee, this is why I personally caution you before you vote on House Bill 45. I'm actually someone who did have a copy of proof of citizenship, unlike many others, for numerous possible factors which have been stated, do not have that. And yet I was still disenfranchised, which is not a term I use lightly. It is not as simple as handing over a copy of your proof of citizenship and having everything be done with. Even if, for argument's sake, everyone did have proof of his or her citizenship, you also have to have an election system capable of handling this requirement, which, as evident in my case, as well as photos and images and videos of early voting last November is not the case. First of all, I still don't understand why, even though all this time I've been flagged as a non-citizen, I still received an official voter registration card back in September of 2007. I believe Ms. Handel's office should have notified me then, not on October 28th, a mere 7 days before the election. Second of all, I don't understand why Gwinnett County never notified me, even after my absentee ballot application had been processed, that I was still in the system as a non-citizen. It was only because I took the initiative to call them that I found this out, this crucial detail that they should have told me without prompt. Third, please consider 3 things. 1, I spent 2 hours on the phone on hold, so I was obviously, as some people have testified, not the only one with these issues. Second of all, this was not just a case of 1 or 2 officials being unable to help. I spoke to many different people, none of whom could ever figure out why the heck my documents were not being processed. 3, consider that not only did all these people not know what was going on, but also that I received contradictory information, like needing to send my proof of citizenship to the Secretary's office as opposed to Gwinnett County. Add all of this up and it becomes clear that there's just not a capacity nor proper coordination between the Secretary of State's office and the county offices to deal with this additional paperwork requirement that would be part of this House bill. I was very fortunate because I took to heart the lessons in civics that I had learned in the Georgia public school system, that voting is not just a privilege but a responsibility. I was also very fortunate that my father long ago taught me that I need to document absolutely everything and to keep lots of copies. But what about the many others who are citizens with documents who perhaps like me have scheduling and transportation issues that necessitate their voting absentee, but who unlike me do not have a fax machine at home, do not have 2 hours to wait on hold on the phone, and do not have the sheer willpower to jump through the hoops in order to cast their one legitimate vote? I ask that you think of them, of me, of others like me in considering House Bill 45. And with that, I thank you for listening to me.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Have you checked to see if you're still flagged?
I have not.
I appreciate your testimony, and I'm sorry that you went through what you did, but I guess I would ask, why haven't you checked to see if you're still flagged?
As I said in my testimony, I've had family concerns, schoolwork concerns that essentially I believed at that point. I also said in my testimony that I'd fulfilled my civic responsibilities to do so. And I believed that it probably counted, but at the same time, I didn't want to jump through yet another hoop.
Well, I would certainly, I'm sorry about your scenario, and I hate that anybody who is a citizen, whether they be born here or naturalized, would have to go through what you went through. But I guess, as I listen to the testimony, I again would say, why haven't you bothered to see if you're still flagged?
What is the intent of your question?
To see if you're still flagged.
Because there is no vote coming up.
Wouldn't it be more practical to determine now if there was still an error with your voter registration
sure.
before the election?
That's probably correct, and I still stand by my statement that I have other concerns to deal with. Now, how does that concern this bill? I'm not exactly sure.
Well, I was just wondering, why you wouldn't go back and check to see if you were still flagged.
I will do so. That's a legitimate concern, and I recognize that. But I still stand by my statement that I have all these matters to deal with, and I believe at that point that it would be fine, because I was calling them up until the day of the election to do so.
Representative Morgan, do you have questions?
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I am sorry that you had to go through all of that. Quite frankly, as a legislator, as the chairman has asked the previous individual who talked about Fulton County, we all are concerned about things that happen certainly in isolation, but our major concern is what happens statewide. And so my question is, do you think this is an isolated situation?
I've read up on the statistics. I actually read that AJC article before this happened to me, and I thought, oh, this is unfortunate. I'm glad it's not me. So I know it's not an isolated case. And I believe that you should be a citizen to be allowed to vote. At the same time, there have been many more disenfranchised who are citizens like me, who maybe just didn't, it's not just absentee ballot voting. As Ms. Berry testified to, there are not just those circumstances in which people have been disenfranchised. So it's not limited to people wanting to vote absentee, and I believe it's a statewide issue.
One other question. We keep hearing the number somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 of people who had to be verified or their citizenship was in question. Do you think that the 2,000 people, whatever the number was that was in question that never did come forth, do you think they would be willing to go through all that you went through in order to vote?
That's my point, and I haven't done the research, and I don't think all of us know exactly whether those 2,000 people are citizens or not, and we don't know. At the same time, I would believe that some of them are people that just didn't want to jump through yet another hoop of appearing at a courthouse, of calling people in order to exercise the right to vote.
Thank you. Sure. No further questions. Meredith Belt-Platts for the ACLU.
I actually have a written statement,
That's
hoping
fine.
to move things along. Can I?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you so much for the time to address you and this body about a very important issue. My name is Meredith Bell-Platts. I am a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union Voting Rights Project here in Atlanta, and I speak today in opposition to House Bill 45. As you're receiving now, there's a written statement and 2 documents that are attached to that, and I submit those for you to peruse over at your leisure in hopes of moving my testimony forward quite a bit today. The problem with this bill is it really does take a sledgehammer approach to what is, at best, a small problem. And with all due respect to the proponents of this bill, while it may be seen as disrespectful to the people who have died both on foreign shores and domestic shores for the right to vote, it is equally disrespectful to deny a ballot, to merely deny the registration process to their relatives and ancestors who are here now because they do not happen to have one of the types of documentation readily available at the time that they fill out their voter registration form in order to be registered to vote. The impact of these laws is going to fall disproportionately on citizens. If you believe the statistics that have been bandied around both in these testimonies today and also in the national media, overwhelmingly the numbers suggest that citizens are the ones who are being wrongfully targeted, wrongfully flagged as non-citizens. As the young lady who testified, 2 people before me, who was born in Boston, Massachusetts, her citizenship was questioned. This was not because she was one of 5,000, which has been alleged to have somehow provided inaccurate information or told the Department of Driver Services that they were non-citizens or some other database match issue. This was someone who was born in the United States. So it's not an issue for her, for someone who, when she received her driver's license, in the first instance said that she was not yet a citizen, then became a citizen and didn't correct that record. So there are citizens, native-born as well as naturalized citizens, who are wrongfully caught up in this process. So let's discuss briefly the 4,700 who have been said to have received the letters. It is true that the Secretary of State's office was sued by many organizations for this database match problem. One of the reasons for that was the timeliness of it, that it took place within a window where those kinds of voter list maintenance issues should not be done under the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. The other reason was because it had not been pre-cleared by the Department of Justice, which is required under Section 5. We have since found out throughout this process that 2,040 people were able to come in and show that they were, in fact, citizens, even though the database match record said that they were not. What we do not know is what happened to the roughly 2,700 other people. We do not know that they are not citizens. We do not know if they don't have the proof of citizenship with them and were unable to comply, as the other gentleman who testified said, with all the hurdles that were necessary. We don't know very much about them right now. As part of DOJ's inquiry under Section 5, they have requested more information, a rather lengthy request for more information from the Secretary of State's office. And I enclose as one of the attachments the letter from the Department of Justice as a way of considering the kinds of proof that this state would have to put forward to the Department of Justice if such a bill as this is enacted into law. These are the types of inquiries that Georgia would have to answer for. In an earlier testimony, it was reported that the Secretary of State's office has responded to that request. I called Chris Herron from the Department of Justice myself on Friday concerned about that, and he told me that as of February 13th, 2009, he did receive a letter from Mr. Dennis Dunn with the state's AG's office requesting 30 more days to reply to their request. So as of today, neither the Department of Justice nor I can say anything else about this issue. I also want to speak briefly about the EAC letter that is also attached to this. That was a letter from the Election Administration Commission, which was formed under the Help America Vote Act to implement the federal forms and to make sure that the federal form includes all the requirements under federal law for registration. It has been reported that Arizona did enact a proof of citizenship requirement, among other things, and they requested of the EAC that the form be adjusted for Arizona's requirement. The letter that you have received is the response from the EAC about this. The problem with this provision is you must accept the federal form. You cannot make additions, attachments, or whatever to the federal form in order for someone to register to vote. You cannot require that it be notarized. You cannot require that additional information be supplied. That was the subject of a lawsuit that was brought in 2005 in Georgia, at which point the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said that the federal form, if filled out properly, is sufficient to be a registered voter in this state, and you must accept it as such. And the opinion about that is also listed in my written testimony. That is the Charles H. Wesley Foundation versus Cox decision that you might want to check out. To not accept the federal form is a violation of the National Voter Registration Act. And so that is yet another hurdle. Finally, there is the concern about this being a poll tax. And we do not use that term lightly. For someone who does not have the documentation on them, it is $10 in the state of Georgia to go get a birth certificate. Even that requires a photo identification. Many other states, it ranges from $10 to $25. There is a time issue involved. When I moved to Georgia from Ohio, I had to get my birth certificate from the state of Ohio. My mother couldn't find it. I had to request it from the state. It took the state 90 days to get me my birth certificate. At that time, I wasn't married, so all the names were proper. 90 days. That's a problem for someone who is going to realize when they fill out the voter registration form that they don't have that documentation with them at that time. That person will not be able to register to vote. They will not be able to vote in an election. That is a bar, a permanent bar for them for that particular election. It is a fee to request that information. For the person who is naturalized, the naturalization process, if you do not have your copy of your certificate of naturalization on you, which it does say very clearly on the certificate that it is illegal to copy that certificate. If you do not have it and have to request it from the USCIS, in 2006 it was $220 to receive a duplicate copy. It is now $380. There is no fail-safe provision in this law that helps people who are unable to get these documents in time or the fee to pay for it. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate, because a lot of what I would further say is in the document, and there are many other people who do wish to speak about this bill. We need to be very careful what we do, because there is a deterrent effect. There are people who do not come back to the political process after they have faced a hurdle that they believe is unfair, that there are perceptions of them that they are not true to their word, that they are not actually citizens when they are. And the people who are most likely to step out of the process may not step back into it. These are people who are your voters. These are people who vote for you. And I'm sure that you take that responsibility very seriously. But I would say that it is equally insulting to tell a person who is lawfully able and eligible to vote that in the state of Georgia you cannot do that unless you come forward with a piece of paper that is not required but by one other state in the union right now. And even in that state, even in Arizona, that is still embroiled in litigation over that. So I thank you very much for your time, and if there are any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them.
I don't see any questions. Moving on, we've got Neil Bradley and Polly McKinney.
Hi, I'm Polly McKinney. I'm the Executive Director for the League of Women Voters of Georgia. I'll be brief, and then I'll let Neil stand up here and talk. We support full voting participation by all eligible American citizens and oppose efforts to create new barriers that block citizen voter participation, and we therefore oppose this bill. And as I've said many times in the last couple of weeks, I can't say it any better than Randy Evans did, as quoted in the Daily Journal. The burden it imposes is greater than the justification for it or the harm the state suffers. My biggest worry is whether people will go register to vote. It will become a hassle, and they will just say, never mind. And he's I'm sure you all know, general counsel to the GOP, but he sums up, in essence, all I have to say. I'm going to let Neil talk.
Thank you. I'll be brief. With due respect to the sponsor, I mentioned Atkinson County when I spoke before, and I said that was an example of people being given wrong information. There, the candidate went out, told non-citizens they could register and they could vote, and he got caught. So, we don't disagree on the facts of that case, and I did mention it when I spoke before. I would like to say two things that aren't legal arguments. There's a reason no other state has this bill. Arizona was adopted by initiative and referendum. It was definitely an anti-immigrant vote. It had to do with social services and schools and other things. The Chamber of Commerce of the state of Arizona campaigned against that referendum. They did not want that bill passed, and none of the other 49 states have enacted a similar bill because, I want to say, they trust their voters. Every registered voter swears under penalty of perjury under both federal and state law under a felony that they are a citizen. It's on the form. And that's a serious oath. We don't have any indication that people do not take that oath seriously. We accept in Georgia to serve on jury service the oath that you are a citizen. We accept oaths of people to send people to jail and to send them, to execute them in this state. But to say to Georgia voters, we don't trust you about swearing that you are a citizen, come and show us your birth certificate because we don't trust you, is insulting to the voters. And it really is disheartening if this legislation would be passed. That's the end of my comments. I thank the committee.
Elise Shore.
Good afternoon, honorable members of the committee. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Elise Shore, and I'm the regional counsel with MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We, along with the ACLU and several other groups, are involved in the litigation challenging the Secretary of State's non-pre-cleared implementation of the database matching system that we've heard so much about from both citizens who are voting, who have tried and successfully, notwithstanding the barriers put in their place, voted in the state of Georgia. I want to be very brief about my comments today. MALDEF opposes HB 45 for two main reasons. First and foremost, there is not evidence to support the myth that non-citizens vote. We have heard evidence about Atkinson County. That was, I'm not going to reiterate that testimony, but that was somebody who was running who was telling people the wrong information. That is not evidence of a non-citizen voting. In fact, history shows that the only thing these types of laws do is to create barriers to voting, and the recent election history in Georgia shows that citizens have encountered barriers when trying to exercise their right to vote. You all have already heard the testimony about that, so I'm not going to go into more detail about that. The absence of prosecutions of non-citizens voters, along with the Department of Justice investigations and prosecutions of intimidation and harassment of citizen voters based on citizenship challenges in the state of Georgia, suggests that this law is not necessary. The non-citizen community in Georgia is well aware that their very status and very existence in this state is precarious, and the community is cautious about any type of interaction it will have with government authorities. In addition, federal law mandates strict penalties for those who register while knowing they are ineligible to vote in federal elections. Premeditated attempts to commit voter fraud carry penalties of up to $10,000 and 10 years in prison. Violation of federal election law can lead to deportation of non-citizens, including legal permanent residents. Non-citizens know this. They do not try to register to vote, especially when they know deportation is a possibility, and particularly in light of the fact that law enforcement activities today in the state of Georgia are currently focused on methods to increase ways to deport people who are here in this country. Further, recent election history in Georgia shows that qualified and eligible citizens, whom we've heard from today, who are registered voters, are encountering problems when trying to exercise their right to vote. By way of example, the eligibility of Spanish surname registered voters was mass challenged in Long County, Georgia, back in 2004. The Department of Justice investigated this and filed a lawsuit against Long County. The court entered an order, a consent order, stating that the county had violated the voting rights of the Latino voters by requiring them to prove citizenship when the county knew that the citizenship challenges were not supported by any credible proof that the voters were not citizens. Similarly, in 2008, as we've heard, very close to the election, an unprecleared database verification procedure was implemented in the state of Georgia that was used to challenge the citizenship status of voters. The result was that thousands of voters, some of whom we've heard from today, were inaccurately identified as non-citizens. The database matching system was never approved by the Department of Justice and is now the subject of a lawsuit filed in federal court. Based on our preliminary analysis, which has been submitted to the Department of Justice, 72% of the individuals flagged by the Secretary of State as non-citizens before the 2008 presidential election were minority. 33% of the citizens of the people flagged as non-citizens were black, 19% were Hispanic, and 20% were Asian. MALDEF therefore believes that the proof of citizenship proposal addresses a problem that is not a problem, and in fact the problem, as we've heard today, is that citizens are having barriers put in their way when they're trying to exercise their right to vote. This bill would only aggravate that situation by doing more to limit individuals, including the elderly, minorities, and the poor, to limit their right to vote. And so the real impact would then be on United States citizens and burdening their right to vote. With all due respect to what the sponsoring legislator has stated, we would be glad to submit evidence that has come through as a part of the litigation. There have been 2 members of the military that we know of so far who have been identified as non-citizens through this flagging system. One of them was in Clayton County, and another one was Karen Branch, whom we would be glad to try to submit her testimony. She was not available. She was a veteran of Desert Storm, and she was designated as a non-citizen and went through several hoops to try to show her citizenship when she went to vote in the fall. So even members of the military have been flagged as non-citizens under this faulty database matching system. In addition,
can I ask you a question there?
Certainly.
Was she denied the right to vote?
No, she did have to go back several times, I believe, and we can submit the information to get her proof of citizenship. She was told her passport was not sufficient, and I believe she had to go back and get her birth certificate as well.
But she was not denied the right to vote.
No.
Thank you.
I believe she did vote. After having to go back twice to her house, I believe, to get her further citizenship documents. And again, we would be glad to submit any additional information, and we will submit Ms. Berry's information to the honorable members of the committee. In addition, before this bill could go into effect, as we've heard earlier, it would be subject to pre-clearance by the Department of Justice under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We know that as recently as December 2008, the DOJ has requested more information from the Secretary of State regarding this letter. The first time that we have heard today that the Secretary of State has actually responded to that request for a motion for extension of time, so to speak, was today. We had not been previously informed of that through the litigation. So that the Secretary to date, from December, has not responded to the Department of Justice questions regarding the unprecleared verification procedures that were implemented shortly before the November election. If enacted, we believe this law will receive similar rigorous scrutiny by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division under the current administration. We believe the review would ultimately result in the denial of this scheme that's proposed here. For these reasons, we respectfully request that you do not vote in favor of this bill, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
There are no questions.
Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
I'm having a hard time reading the next name, but it looks like maybe Anthony.
Arthur?
Maybe. Okay. You can sit down if you'd like to. Arthur, you're welcome to sit if it's easier for you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is
Excuse me. You're going to have to pull, if you would, please, pull the mic a little closer so we can hear.
It's okay now?
Can you hear now? Thank you.
My name is Arthur Remillard. I'm a resident of Braselton, Georgia, where I have lived since 2004. I was born in Massachusetts in 1933 in New Bedford, Mass. And in the 1960s, I relocated to Florida. I am here to testify that Georgia state laws have prevented me from obtaining a driver's license and also voting, also deprived me of voting since I moved to the state nearly 5 years ago. In 2004, my wife and I were living in Panama City, Florida. My wife got deathly ill with cancer and other problems, and we decided to move up to Braselton so that our children who live up here could assist me in helping with the care of my wife. Shortly after arriving in Georgia, I tried to transfer my Florida driver's license to comply with Georgia laws, and the Department of Driver Services informed me that I could not get a Georgia license without a birth certificate. I informed the Gainesville DSS that represented that I had never possessed a birth certificate. My mother used a midwife and immediately put me up for adoption in 1933. Because I was born out of wedlock, it was not usual to issue birth certificates in 1933. I was able to get my baptismal certificate used by the Catholic Church, but because of the certificate indicates that I was adopted child, the DDS again refused to issue me a driver's license. After being turned away a total of 3 times by the Georgia Department of Driver Services, I contacted the state of Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles to see if they could assist me. They kindly issued me a change of address sticker for the state of Florida to put on my Florida driver's license, effectively making me a Florida licensed driver living in the state of Georgia. I was able to use my Florida license as identification until it expired in late 2007, and since then I have had no other course but to drive unlicensed when needed. According to the state of Georgia, I do not exist. I cannot believe that the state of Georgia is so eager to deprive me of my constitutional rights to vote, and that as a senior citizen, I am being intentionally deprived to vote. Proof that I am a citizen, the state of Georgia has forced me to break the law every time I need to go to a doctor's appointment, to go and do some shopping, to go visit my children. Many of my friends are in the same situation, unable to get documents that have issued them 3/4 of a century ago, and forced to break the laws on a daily basis, based as a result that they cannot get ample proof that they exist in the state of Georgia. 7 of them have since left the state of Georgia to return to their home states or other places where the burden of proof is not so hard, and the laws are designed to help, not hurt, elderly citizens. After struggling to find a solution to my problem for more than a year, I contacted the Gainesville Times newspaper to bring light on my problem. I asked if, as elected officials of the state of Georgia, to change requirements to accommodate people such as myself who have fallen through the cracks of the system and are being deprived, being a, excuse me, being deprived at every turn. I was born in the United States. To my knowledge, that automatically makes you a citizen of the United States, but that doesn't seem to be recognized here in the state of Georgia. Thank you.
If I may, Craig is going to get somebody from the Department of Driver Services that will assist you in obtaining at least an official state identification card. As far as the driver's license goes, you would have to pass the driver's license test with regard to vision and other things. But I don't know why you've had such a hard time in this state. But I'm sorry, but Department of Driver Services will be available to help you with the ID. I don't know. I guess I'm a little confused with the testimony and how it applies to this legislation. But Craig, were you able to get Les?
I'm going to get his information.
Okay.
Les is gone for the day, but he'll be in the morning.
We will get your information. We will do. We'll help you with your issue, but I don't see how it has to do with this particular piece of legislation. Representative Morgan.
Mr. Chairman, if this gentleman, first of all, thank you, sir, for your testimony, and I'm sorry, I'm glad that the chairman is, hopefully we'll be able to rectify this before you leave. But Mr. Chairman, what he's essentially saying is if he doesn't have a driver's license, he certainly doesn't have his birth certificate. So under this bill, if he's not already registered to vote, he couldn't register to vote. So that's how this applies.
Well,
and people in his situation, like my husband's grandmother, are in this same situation.
I don't agree with you on that because you can go through the Department of Driver Services and obtain,
if we can help him today, you're right.
And obtain the identification. And I've had to do that for my constituents who have called me who born to a midwife, not to a midwife, but midwives who are, you know, they weren't born in a hospital. No birth certificate was issued at that time through the probate court, and we passed the bill last year to help people obtain a delayed birth certificate. The delayed birth certificate avenue is there and can be taken, but we will work with the Department of Driver Services. Craig will do what he can to help you with your situation.
Just one other comment, and so this gentleman we can help today, and yes, hopefully we will, but the people who are not testifying before this committee at this moment, who aren't getting your attention, our attention, who are in this same situation, are not going to be helped, and that's the problem, and that's why this relates to this particular bill.
I understand, and they do have the same rights to request help
if they know how to access that.
I agree. I agree with that statement. Thank you. If you'll make sure that we get your information, Craig will work with Department of Driver Services to help you get your issues resolved. Thank you for testifying. Jerry, Representative Powell.
Mr. Arthur, if I might ask a question. You've been in Brazelton how long? When did you move up? How long have you been here from Florida?
Close to 5 years now.
Did you ever contact your state senator or state representative about helping you in getting your?
No, I haven't contacted any state representative, but one of the steps I did take is that I contacted the state legal services, and the young lady who took the case has been working on it for over a year, and as of 3 months ago, she dropped it all altogether because she said she couldn't get anywhere with it.
Well, if I may, you went to somebody that was looking to sue the state.
She was having about the same luck as I have, getting nowhere.
Well, maybe if some of these people that were so interested in suing people were more interested in helping people, we could get somewhere. We're going to help you, though. We're going to help you.
Thank you.
Jerry Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jerry Gonzalez. I am Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials, and I would like to address some of the comments that have been made. We're here to strongly oppose HB 45. To suggest that our organizations do not view the right to vote as sacred because we take opposing sides is simply ridiculous and simply ludicrous. We want to protect the right of every citizen to exercise the right to vote. We have members of the military that have been impacted by this legislation. We have U.S. citizens that several hurdles and obstacles have been put before them because of the illegal procedure that the Secretary of State adopted before the election. And this legislation would put additional hurdles on the front end of the voter registration process. Latino voter registration in the state of Georgia has been dramatically increasing. We have seen that over the last several years, and I'll talk about some numbers. According to the Immigration Policy Center, in 2006, new American voters, naturalized or children born of immigrants, like we heard testimony from earlier today, represented 3.7% of the voting population in Georgia. That's a total of 146,000 people. As of October 2008, Galeo estimates that there are 100,000 Latinos registered in the state of Georgia, which is about 2% of the overall electorate. 18,625 registered to vote in 2008. That was an increase from the previous year. Cobb County has seen growth rates of 645% from January 2003 to October 2008. Started in January 2003, 1,063, and as of October 2008, 7,915. Hall County, Representative Mills, has seen a growth rate of 592% increase in Latino voter registration, going from 468 to 3,239. Gwinnett County has seen over 1,500% increase in Latino voter registration, going from 803 registered voters in January of 2003 to 13,504 as of October 2008. These are eligible citizens registering to vote, wanting to be part of our democracy, wanting to be part of the process. I've spoken to many naturalized citizens that have extreme pride when they do become citizens and swear allegiance to this country and this Constitution to make sure that they can exercise their right to vote. They say, Jerry, I'm a citizen now. I want to participate in the electoral process. How do I do that? And I've helped many recently naturalized citizens to vote. Many of these recently naturalized citizens are not completely proficient in English, which raises problems. An elderly voter this past election cycle in Gwinnett County got one of these little letters that Gwinnett County was sending based on the scheme that the Secretary of State adopted. She was scared. She was intimidated. She was frightened, frankly, because the letter said that she could go to prison. Fortunately, she was related to one of our members. The member called me. I spoke with the elderly woman for about an hour on the phone saying, ma'am, you're a citizen. You have every right to go vote. You should go vote. I will go with you to go vote. It took me an hour to convince her. She lives in a group home, doesn't have transportation, has an expired Georgia ID. She was scared. She says, they're going to send me to prison. They're saying right here in this letter that they're going to send me to prison. She's limited English proficient. She really didn't understand the full context of it. She is eligible to vote. I did take her to go early vote in Gwinnett County. So yes, we do care and we do help when we hear about it. She was confused. When we got to the Gwinnett County Elections Office, there was confusion about her exercising her right to vote. And it took us another hour of waiting at the elections office before she was able to exercise her right to vote. On election day, we got a call from a recently naturalized citizen that registered to vote that had gotten one of these letters on Friday before the election. He had been notified Friday before the election that he needed to prove his citizenship. He didn't have vehicle. DeKalb County said, you need to come to the DeKalb County Elections Office. We need to clarify that. Then you need to go to your precinct to exercise your right to vote. We took one of my interns off our hotline on election day, took him off and said, go get this voter, take him to DeKalb County Elections Office, prove his citizenship. They gave him the paperwork, and he voted. It is sacred. You shouldn't be laughing, Representative Mills, but it is sacred. It is sacred, and we need to protect everybody's right to vote. And putting naturalized citizens through all these other obstacles, that current testimony from the gentleman that was the naturalized citizen as well, that he had to go through, is not right. And it's not a laughing matter. It is sacred, and we need to protect the right to vote of all eligible citizens to vote in this state. Thank you. I'll answer questions if there are any.
I don't have any questions for you.
Thank you.
Mr. King, you had asked to speak on this legislation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier I introduced myself as D.A. King and said I was here as a private citizen. I am also president of a nonprofit organization called the Dustin Inman Society, a fact of which I am very proud. Dustin Inman was a young man who lost his life because our borders are not secure. I came here today to talk about Representative Mills' very well thought out bill. I want to make it clear to all concerned, I will not be so rude and disrespectful to the elected office of anyone in this room to tell them when or when they should not laugh. What I have done, as usually happens, is I have sat down on the end of the bench and watched discussion about whether or not we are going to equally apply a voter registration law become, I heard questions about hate groups. I've heard about anti-immigrants. I've heard someone make a big deal out of the fact that someone in the military was regarded as a non-citizen. Please know, ladies and gentlemen, as a former Marine, I can tell you that we have non-citizens in our military right now. That means absolutely nothing. Okay? It's rhetoric designed to get you to forget what we are sitting here about today. And that is to decide on the front end whether or not we are going to be proactive and apply equally a rule that when you register to vote, you simply have to prove that you are a United States citizen. A minute ago, I heard something about anti-Latino, so I'm going to repeat respectfully my point before. This is a Mexican voter ID. It has a fingerprint and everything I mentioned earlier, and I can tell you very clearly, no one in Mexico regards this as somehow anti-Latino or anti-immigrant. I'm not going to cover all my points, but again, I hope we all remember why we're sitting here. Someone mentioned that a potential voter was not English proficient, but eligible to vote because she was a citizen. Again, I have to respectfully remind somebody, or everybody, that to become a citizen, to become naturalized in this country, you have to demonstrate proficiency in English. I know this because my adopted sister is a real legal immigrant who happened to come here from Korea, as are many of my supporters. A lot of times we hear anti-immigrant when it has nothing to do with the topic, but just as a handy way to tell the difference between somebody who is an immigrant, which designates coming to this country lawfully, and someone who is not an immigrant, who did not come here lawfully, please remember, immigrants do not require amnesty. Again, I am here to support Representative Mills' bill. I hope that you can see through the smoke and mirrors that have been put up. A variety of reasons. One question that was not asked of Representative Mills when he first stood up was whether or not he still beat his wife. But I think if we sit here long enough, that will probably show up. I'm finished, Mr. Chairman. I have more to say, but I don't regard the Secretary of State's office as created a scheme. I think that they are regulating what is apparently a very sacred right and at least a sacred privilege. And I think it's so important a privilege that people need to take the trouble to demonstrate that they are eligible to vote again before they get to the poll. Mr. Chairman, a member of my board of advisors, a lady named Inger Eberhardt, got here just after, a little bit too late to sign up on the sign-up sheet. She assures me she can just show her support in 20 seconds. I would respectfully ask if we could listen to her.
That's okay if she can keep it under 1 minute, but I want to request that you do one thing, Mr. King. When you testify again, if you bring that, just if you would, make sure you take a piece of black tape. I don't think it's going to show up on the TV, but to cover the name, if you will, of the person on the card.
I will certainly take that into consideration, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for allowing me to speak before you today. My name is Inger Eberhardt, and I'm a member of the board of the Dustin Emmons Society. And I'm just asking that you vote in support of this particular bill. Thanks.
Thank you. Representative Mills. That concludes public testimony. If you'd like to speak to anything.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I just, you've heard a couple of testimonies of two different people who got flagged during the last election process. I submit to you they make an excellent case for the passage of this bill today, because had it been in place, they would have never been flagged because they would have provided proof of citizenship prior to registering to vote. Thereby, they would have never had any problem. Secondly, they make a case for the passage of this bill on the basis that you heard problems from different counties. You heard a problem, I think, from Gwinnett County, was the other, Fulton County. Because there is no statewide standard in place sometimes, some counties interpret a little bit differently. And this bill would put a statewide standard in place, and those problems would be preempted by pre-clearing their citizenship prior to the voting process, and they'd never be flagged again. So that would solve their situation. The gentleman who testified, who came from Brazelton, his situation is dealt with in language G that the subcommittee added, and he would be covered there because we asked his exact questions during subcommittee. The Legislative Counsel, Jeff Lanier, Secretary of State, had already run into this question as well, and that language was vetted through the subcommittee process to address that situation. So, I'm certainly always open to making the bill better, but I think what we've got here is a very good bill, and it's it's been my experience that when certain groups are adamantly opposed to things, a lot of times you got a good bill. A lot of times you don't. But I would say to you that if the ACLU had gotten their way, we had a bill that came through the legislature several years back, and I added a little amendment, and they opposed that amendment all the way through the entire process. It was eventually signed into law. But if they had their way about it, we'd be doing a whole lot of things differently, that's for sure. In the Banking Committee, I have the pleasure of serving there, and we began our committee with prayer, not because we're better than anybody else, but because we need it. I need it more than anybody. They would be opposed to that. They want to see that stopped. And I would say to you that I don't back up 1 inch saying that I take voting as a sacred right. If someone wants to read something into that, I'm sorry for that. But that was not an indicting statement. It was a statement saying that I do believe voting to be a very sacred process. I think House Bill 45 keeps it that way and ensures that for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Mills. Representative, do you have something to say?
I had a question about, for the author, regarding the national voter registration form. And then at the proper time, I'd like to be recognized for a motion. You don't know what that motion is, Mr. Chair. You should try it out.
I can guess.
You might be wrong. Try it. Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am.
You heard someone testify regarding the national voter registration form, and so certainly as a state legislature, we can't override federal law. And so if someone in some of these individuals in these situations were to fill out the national voter registration form, do you think that would make your bill null and void?
I do not. This bill was patterned again after the state of Arizona, which has already been put through the courts, tested, tried, proved, and validated, pre-cleared, after cleared, current constitutionally correct by the courts, not by me. So take my opinion out of the equation.
All right. We're going to move into the procedural aspect of the legislation. I know that Representative Powell has an amendment that he wants to offer. Is that correct, Representative Powell? All right. Let's start seeing if we have a motion on, what's the proper LC number? We have before us the House Committee on Governmental Affairs, substitute to House Bill 45, LC 284599S. Is there a motion on the legislation? All right, there's a motion. Is there a second? All right, the bill has been properly moved and seconded. All right, Representative. Representative, as you know, we've always accepted those motions for a vote, and I'm going to allow you the vote, as we've always done in this committee. And after that, I'd appreciate it if we only had one procedural like that. All right. Thank you. All right, we have a motion to table. Is there a second? All right. There's a motion to table and a second. That motion takes precedent over the others. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing no discussion, all of those in favor of tabling, please raise your right hand. All of those opposed? The motion fails. All right. So now we're back to the original motion. Representative Powell has asked that he be allowed to offer an amendment. Representative Powell, would you like to read that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I move that for the favorable consideration of this committee, that we amend this bill on page 2, line 51, which is categorized as G, and replace that language with other documents and methods by which bona fide residents of this state and who are a U.S. citizen who are not in possession of any of the documents enumerated in subparagraphs A through F of this paragraph may register to vote shall be permitted by rule and regulation of the State Elections Board. And you probably have to get our counsel. He drafted that. We sort of scratched that together. Bottom line, this says that the State Elections Board, that they will establish rules and regulations for those cases out there of people who don't have IDs, who don't have these documentation, so as to guarantee that people will have an opportunity to present their case that they are a citizen for those who fall in the cracks.
Mr. Chairman, would it be okay for me to have the Secretary of State's office respond to this amendment and what they think it would do to the carrying out of this bill? I think it's very important as the committee decides to hear.
That's briefly, please. I'm reading it right now and trying to. And if the Secretary of State has a simpler way to accomplish what Representative Powell is offering.
I'm sorry, Representative Powell, could you read it one more time so I can
I can read
Mr.
it.
Chairman, I'm sorry.
It's essentially replacing the language in G with other documents and methods by which bona fide residents of this state who are U.S. citizens who are not in possession of any of the documents enumerated in subparagraphs A through F of this paragraph may register to vote that shall be promulgated by rule and regulation of the State Elections Board. And
Yeah, my concern, Mr. Chairman, frankly, would be the language of shall, because the legislation would be directing the State Election Board, as the mechanics of the law, to I don't know where you would refine the number of documents that could be provided, because you're not tying it to citizenship. So if another document would be a utility bill, and the individual registering to vote would say that they were a citizen, that would not be proof. That would be my concern, and maybe the Legislative Council could. That would be my initial concern.
If I might suggest some, what if we said, Jeff, the State Elections Board shall establish, under rules and regulations, other documents and methods of proof that or by which bona fide residents of this state who are U.S. citizens shall be entitled to register to vote.
That's an additional sentence, Mr. Chairman. It would not fit G because it's not a listing of documents. But if you want to add that as an additional sentence, that would be.
No, sir, I don't want to add it. I'm reading G, and G reads as other documents and methods by which bona fide residents of the state. All right. If you go back up to 2 starts, satisfactory evidence of citizenship shall include any of the following. And then it lists A through F. And then G would be other documents and methods by which bona fide residents of this state who are U.S. citizens who are not in possession of any of the documents enumerated in subparagraphs A through F of this paragraph may register to vote that shall be promulgated by rule and regulation of the State Elections Board. Okay. It does make sense when you read
it. Either one.
It makes sense when you put 2 in front of it, when you read it as a whole instead of as a part. What is your concern?
Well, Mr. Chairman, were you suggesting that language or Representative Powell's? Okay.
Let's go back to Representative Powell's language. His language makes sense when you read it in conjunction with line 28, which is the way it should be read. I was reading it as a separate paragraph, but it's not a separate paragraph.
Yeah, I think we would be satisfied with that, Representative Powell.
And y'all do understand the purpose of this.
I do.
The purpose of this is quite simply that if someone wants to register to vote, if they're like the gentleman back here, he's fallen between the cracks, he can prove that he is a U.S. citizen. He's got a right to vote. His right should be taken care of. That y'all will promulgate rules. Y'all will promulgate, not may, but y'all will promulgate these rules and regulations so as to guarantee that anyone who's a bona fide citizen and a U.S. resident will be able to show that in some form.
No, I understand the intent, Representative Powell.
No problems with that?
I don't believe so.
Good.
Can I see that sheet?
There you go.
So just so the committee understands the amendment, Mary Margaret, do you want to read it? It would be a new paragraph G starting on line 51. All right. Representative Powell has moved on his amendment. You have moved on your amendment, haven't you?
I have.
All right. There's a motion and a second on the amendment. Any further discussion about the amendment? Representative, enlighten us.
Well, Mr. Chair, my only concern is I appreciate the gentleman's amendment, but I don't understand how a person could show proof. If they don't have these things, what else out there can they provide? And perhaps the Secretary of State's office can enlighten me on what he thinks the Board of Elections could actually put in place as a process. Does that mean that this gentleman who does not have a driver's license is going to be asked to drive down to the Board of Elections meeting to prove that he's a citizen? What does that mean? What does the process look like?
Mr. Chairman, to Representative Morgan's question, I don't know that I can say today what the State Election Board rules and regs would look like for this legislation because there's a formalized rule-making process that the state election board has to go through, which includes posting of proposed rules, public hearing, and things of that nature. So as a reflection of that process, they could include, I would expect the SCB would become knowledgeable of other documents that may be relevant and acceptable. I couldn't speculate as to what those would be right now.
So no one knows what this process would be. We're just going to put it in the bill.
Well, it would be up to the Board of Elections to determine that.
Well,
the State Board of Elections.
Correct. Yes, sir.
And it requires them to do that, I think, is the key provision of it. It takes it from being optional to mandatory. Representative Hatfield.
Mr. Chairman, I was just thinking maybe you could have the same sort of proof of citizenship that the President has offered to show that he's a citizen of the United States.
All right, let's not. I know. I thought he was asleep down there. We hadn't heard from him all day. All right. Representative Powell's amendment has been properly moved and seconded. Is there any objection to adopting Representative Powell's amendment? All right. Hearing no objection to adopting the amendment is adopted. We now have before us House Committee on Governmental Affairs substitute the HB 45 as amended for final consideration. Any further discussion on the legislation? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign. No. Do you want a show of hands? The bill is passed. It's in rules. Thank you. What else have we got left? All right, 209. You can stay there if you want to, Alicia. We had for consideration before us House Bill 209. We have a new LC number, LC 284652S. Representative, are you satisfied with the language? Do you want to make a motion on House Bill 209? All right. Bill has been properly moved and seconded. Any discussion on House Bill 209? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign. All right. That bill's in rules. House Bill 406. Is that it?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fellow committee members, I bring before you House Bill 406. This one hopefully won't take as much discussion as the previous bills have taken. It's a pretty simple piece of legislation. It's more of a housekeeping measure. As you know, you guys were very instrumental in me passing the reservoir bill last year to help deal with the future water supply needs of the state. And I think as we went along, we missed a little small something, and what this bill does is address that issue. It's a loophole we missed. The problem is this. Where a local government or water sewer authority or GFA is ready to go with a new water supply project to help local governments meet their water supply needs, the reservoir can be held up if they are installed indefinitely by existing service delivery agreements. If the current service delivery agreement does not anticipate the use of local reservoirs, it can hold up the construction of the project and state funding and all the permitting, even if it is a good project. 406 will address this problem by amending the service delivery law to make it possible for an applicant who is ready to go on the reservoir to do so. Basically, this bill allows the applicant to go forward to get the permitting and the financing to get the project done. One other thing it does is also says within 1 year of the reservoir coming online, they will basically massage the service delivery agreement to reflect the new reservoir being online. I appreciate your favorable consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any questions of the members of the committee?
Oh, you babe. Very carefully.
Yes, sir. All right. Is there anybody else that would like to Is there anybody that would like to testify against this legislation? All right, Representative Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move that this committee do pass whatever that bill number was, 406, as a committee substitute rapidly.
All right. The bill has been properly moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Bills and rules.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys.